Good evening, my friends. I hope this message finds you in a moment of calm, because tonight's story moves through quiet corridors, the kind where history is written not in words, but in whispers. What is happening now in the Sahel is not a headline. It is a shift deliberate, slow, and unsettling to those who once thought Africa would never move without permission. At the center of that shift stands a man whose name has already become a signal. Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier barely past his mid-30s, who stepped out of the barracks and into a storm. To some, he is the new Sankara. To others, he is a dangerous symbol. But to his supporters across the Sahel, he is the face of defiance, the one who said no when silence was easier. When Burkina Faso joined Mali and Niger under the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES, it was more than a military agreement. It was an act of rebellion against a system that had survived for decades by keeping African nations dependent and divided. The AES promised collective defense, joint development, and shared sovereignty. But what it truly represented was something larger, a statement that the Sahel would no longer be a chessboard. In Western capitals, analysts called it reckless. Newspapers wrote of military juntas and authoritarian experiments. But inside the region, something else was happening. People who had long felt invisible were beginning to believe again. From Ouagadougou to Niamey to Bamako, the flags of the three nations flew side by side. Crowds filled the streets, chanting not for politicians, but for independence, a word that had lost meaning until now. Yet independence always has a cost, and for Traoré, that cost began with isolation. Diplomatic doors that once opened easily began to close. Promises of aid turned into conditions. Credit lines shrank. Conferences that used to welcome Burkina Faso stopped sending invitations. Western media, which once barely covered the country, suddenly found new interest, but only to question, to warn, to predict failure. It was not a bullet or a bomb, but it was a kind of attack all the same. The plot to kill Traoré was not a physical one. It was political, economic, psychological, designed to break his government without ever firing a shot. Inside Burkina Faso, however, a different energy was taking hold. Traoré's administration launched the Patriots Fund, a national initiative where citizens contribute to the country's defense. Farmers donated a portion of their harvest. Traders sent money. Soldiers trained civilians to guard their villages. Within months, local defense units, ordinary men and women, began reclaiming areas long abandoned to armed groups. To outsiders, this looked chaotic. To those inside, it was survival. It was the people deciding to fight for their own land when no one else would. Meanwhile, across Africa's presidential palaces, there was silence. Not one major African leader spoke openly in defense of the Sahel Alliance. Some feared Western backlash. Others quietly admired Traoré's courage but chose not to say so. In private meetings, diplomats whispered what they would not admit publicly, that if the AES succeeded, it would redefine Africa's relationship with the world. And if it failed, it would be used as proof that independence is impossible. That silence became the continent's loudest answer. In the months that followed, the AES began to take shape beyond the battlefield. Committees met to design shared border policies, energy corridors, and even the idea of a common currency backed not by foreign banks, but by gold and regional trade. Economic integration was slow but deliberate. Mali and Niger sent engineers to Ouagadougou to study how to create a new logistics route bypassing ECOWAS restrictions. They called it the Sahel Spine, a corridor built not on loans, but on trust. But while the alliance grew, pressure mounted. Regional blocs like ECOWAS, once symbols of African cooperation, threatened sanctions. Western governments warned of democratic backsliding. Commentators began to frame the Sahel's actions as instability rather than independence, yet behind those words lay fear that the Sahel's example could spread. In Senegal, in Chad, in Cameroon, youth movements began echoing the AES message: Africa must defend its own, trade with its own, and feed its own. The irony was not lost on anyone. For years, Africa had been told to find African solutions to African problems. Now that three nations were doing exactly that, the response from outside was not support, but suspicion. It was as if self-determination had become the new threat. Traoré's challenge was never just external. Inside Burkina Faso, he faced the realities of governing a country scarred by war and poverty. Supply routes remained fragile, inflation surged, and displaced families struggled to return home. Yet every public appearance he made drew crowds. Young people shouted his name, not as a politician, but as a symbol of what could be possible when a leader refuses to bow. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the tone of someone who knew the odds. "If sovereignty costs us comfort," he once said, "then it is still cheaper than submission." It was the kind of sentence that drew applause in Ouagadougou and raised eyebrows in Paris. By then, foreign influence in the region was shifting. French troops had withdrawn. American officers expressed concern. Russian and Turkish delegations arrived quietly, offering equipment and training. Chinese engineers scouted for mineral partnerships. Each arrival came with its own risks and promises. Yet Traoré maintained the same line that Burkina Faso's future would be decided in Ouagadougou, not Moscow or Washington. "We do not change masters," he said. "We change direction." That direction was towards sovereignty through cooperation. Within the AES, the three leaders Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani began coordinating joint border patrols, intelligence sharing, and regional infrastructure planning. The alliance proposed its first collective defense exercise, a symbolic move to show the world that the Sahel could protect itself. In local media, analysts began calling it the silent revolution. But the silence surrounding it from the rest of Africa remained deafening. Across the continent, presidents avoided comment. Official statements were vague. And yet, ordinary Africans online were louder than ever. On social media, hashtags like #StandWithAES and #AfricaUnites trended for days. Students, activists, and diaspora communities organized solidarity events. The narrative was changing. The people were speaking when leaders would not. Still, Western commentary persisted in one-tone skepticism. News networks warned of Russian infiltration, authoritarianism, and regional fragmentation. Few discussed the reasons these governments took power in the first place: the collapse of foreign-led security missions, the erosion of trust in international institutions, and the hunger for genuine autonomy. Instead, the story was framed as defiance, not independence. That framing was itself a weapon, part of the same unseen plot to discredit rather than debate. Through all of it, Traoré appeared unmoved. In interviews, he often looked tired but composed, speaking in measured sentences, refusing to raise his voice. It was as though he understood that his calmness was itself an act of resistance. The louder his critics became, the quieter his confidence grew. "They are not angry because we fight," he said in one address. "They are angry because we no longer ask." The AES governments began holding their own media summits, urging African journalists to cover the region's developments without external filters. Local broadcasters started producing documentaries on gold mining, agriculture, and self-reliant defense subjects that rarely made it into international outlets. The goal was to reclaim the narrative, to show that the Sahel was not just a zone of conflict, but a laboratory of courage. But the struggle for narrative control was only one front. Economic warfare continued. International institutions delayed funding for regional projects, citing risk conditions. Trade partners hesitated. Financial networks tied to the CFA tightened credit. Each delay was a message. Isolation is the price of independence. And yet, that pressure seemed to strengthen public resolve. In village after village, people spoke of endurance. They had endured worse under colonial rule. They said they could endure this for freedom. Beyond the Sahel, the silence of Africa's leadership still holds. In Addis Ababa, at the African Union, corridors hum with cautious diplomacy. Some ministers quietly express admiration, others frustration, but few dare to speak publicly, fearing the same political labeling Traore now faces. Silence, once seen as neutrality, has become complicity. And that brings us to the truth behind this story's title, the plot to kill Ibrahim Traoré, not by weapon, but by isolation, not through violence, but through narrative. It is a campaign to erase the possibility that a small landlocked nation could redefine sovereignty. It is about discouraging the idea that Africa can stand without permission. The silence of African presidents, then, is not just political restraint, it is survival. Many of them know what happens when one leader defies the global order too directly. History has taught them. Sankara taught them. Lumumba taught them. But the new generation has learned something different. They have learned that silence can be broken from below. Across the continent, young Africans are watching the AES not as a danger, but as an experiment, one that could either fail and be forgotten, or succeed and be studied for generations. Tonight, as the Sahel moves through uncertainty, the rest of Africa watches. Ibrahim Traoré continues to walk a narrow path between defiance and diplomacy, between hope and hardship. The threats against him are not of assassination, but of isolation. Yet, in every speech, he reminds his people that the greatest weapon of a sovereign nation is belief. Belief that its future belongs to its own hands, not to the signatures of foreign envoys. And so, the story of the Sahel continues, one alliance, one leader, one generation at a time. Whether the world accepts it or not, a new chapter of African agency is being written in real time. It may be silenced in headlines, but it is alive in hearts. The question is no longer whether the Sahel can survive without the West. The question is whether Africa can afford to keep pretending it cannot.